All right, welcome back. It's time to talk about True Detective Night Country, Season 4, Part 3, directed by Issa Lopez, written by Issa Lopez and Alan Page Arriaga. Quite a bit happening in this episode. We start with Hank Pryor recruiting a group of renegade civilians to try and track down Raymond Clark, who was identified in the last episode as a prime suspect of both Annie and the researchers' murders. Danvers and Navarro do not agree with his approach to doing this, do not agree with the people that he's having to use for the search, and certainly make it known to him. His son, Pete Pryor, asks Danvers about the case that drove her and Navarro apart. And we get sort of a cryptic version of this story that may not have all the details. We'll certainly dig into that in a few minutes. But going through the evidence from the Raymond Clark trailer, Danvers and Navarro learn about a hairdresser that Annie used to identify someone else who used to work at the Salal Research Station as an operator. His name is Oliver. Meanwhile, a vet that Pete knows is called in to look at the corpsicle, as it's become known in the circles these days, and decides that these men must not have died from being frozen in the ice. They must have died before, based on a number of things that he can identify. So at the same time, Lund, who's been in the hospital in a coma, wakes up. They rush to him, but before he passes away, all he can do is say something cryptic to Navarro about her mom. And so that's left as a mystery to us. At the same time, Pete finds a video after opening Annie's phone that shows her right before she died. Not much there, but we can dig into sort of what we have seen there and what mysteries that opens. And then all along, there's this continued confrontation between the town, the natives, the miners, the people that live in Ennis, Alaska, and Navarro's stepdaughter, Leah, joins one of the movements protesting the mine work, which infuriates Danvers, even though she can start to see some of the ways that this mine is affecting their town. A lot here, but we'll just kind of start with a big question, which is particularly because of the connections that last week made to season 1 of True Detective. We don't really have those this week necessarily. They opened up a lot of boxes that we don't get to really explore this week, but there's quite a bit of commentary out there from Issa Lopez saying that she had this idea for this story that's being told right now. She was shopping at HBO, said they wanted to do it, but they were also in the process of thinking about a new season of True Detective. Would she be able to mold the story into a True Detective season? Now that we're halfway through, does this seem to you like a True Detective season? Is there something that you can use to identify what a True Detective season is? And does this sort of fit that mold for you?
So I would say yes. And I think it's an interesting question in terms of the details of, well, what was the idea before it became True Detective? Um, so I'm going to refer to a few things here, and then I
Yeah.
guess there's a related question of like, well, how well does it work? Do you
Yes.
feel like,
Yes.
are you trying to make this story a True Detective story? Clearly, okay, but how well does it work? So, I mean, we mentioned previously some rather explicit connections to season 1, the spiral and all of that. You're pointing out that, all right, now in this episode, not really, but thematically, stylistically,
Yeah.
yes, right? Insofar as, well, a couple of things will come to mind for me. For one, we get Danvers and Navarro driving in the car to talk together, and they start having a conversation about God stuff, right? Um, and well, there's a lot of that in season 1 between
Yes.
our protagonists there, kind of hitting on, I don't know, more metaphysical type stakes,
Yeah.
and really setting up Danvers as um, at least a skeptic, and Navarro as more person of faith. The
She
other thing,
laughs in Navarro's face when she tells her that she prays.
yeah, just why you talk to God. Yeah, exactly. So there's some resonances there, some
Yeah.
resonances at least, not going as far as Rust Cole in season 1, which I was rewatching a little bit. There's
Mhm.
this scene where Marty's like, don't say weird stuff like that.
Yeah.
Stop it. Stop. Well, you asked. Um,
Denver trying to guess if it's the chupacabra, and she can't remember what the word for
just
chupacabra
a Chupalupa. The other thing that you mentioned is, and sorry, I started getting ahead of myself. The other thing which you mentioned was in the flashback, as it were, when Danvers is telling Pete about what happened on this Wheeler case, which was the last
is.
case that she and Navarro worked together. You get the story about how he was abusing his wife, but she wouldn't, um, testify against him. And so it kept happening, and they kind of could foresee where it goes. And she's telling Pete how they got there and he had killed his wife, but he also killed himself. They were both dead when they got there. And yet we see on our screen with our own two eyes them showing up and the guy turning and laughing, and he's very much still alive.
Mhm.
That disjunction was something that was all over the place in season one.
Yeah, yeah. This, and I think that that is one of the things that resonated with me is so much that the way that it was portrayed, captured, and told to the audience in season one, this idea of a narrative of we're being interviewed, Marty and Russ being interviewed. Here's the events that happened in terms of what we're telling you, and then let's show you what actually happened. So this story of Navarro and Danvers going to the house of the abuser and finding that situation, her telling Pete Pryor that they found a murder suicide. What actually happened was we are left to deduce he killed his wife. They retaliate and set up some type of, they kill him, set up some kind of suicide. This is sort of very clear season one parallel path here.
Yeah, so I do have a question there. Which one killed him?
Yeah.
Because then they have the radical falling out and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
Other question, tying it back to where you started here, how much does it matter? How much does this bit of the story matter? How much does this flashback with Wheeler
Yeah.
matter? Um, because it is an instance where they are clearly playing with that kind of style of season one in particular, where you had Marty and Rust separately being
Yeah.
interrogated in the present, as it were, about what happened in the past. But we see, and I always thought this was very interesting about True Detective season one, how it really stood out to me as a show that played with this. And I'm sure there are other examples,
Yeah.
but it plays with how when you're watching a television show, what you see is given like ontological priority, right?
Yes.
Like what you're seeing is what really happened. What they're saying is not, right? And that we default in that way. There have been some other shows and movies that have played with this sort of thing in other ways. And maybe this episode too, actually. I don't know. I have another thought or a question we'll get to
Yeah.
a step down the line
I
here.
think even the structure, because I've been going back in my head back and forth about whether I feel like that this is particularly with seasons one and three, where this fits the mold of a true detective season, right? And I find myself thinking about that a lot. And I think that these two are separated detectives falling out. That's obviously a very common theme amongst the seasons. But then the ways that they are coming back together reluctantly, the ways that they are trying to work together reluctantly, reminds me a lot, frankly, of Hayes and West from season three,
Yeah.
when those two detectives came back together after so many years, after someone from a case reappears. And so I just sort of get a sense that, as you said, thematically, certainly in terms of the big ideas, this is very much a true detective season to me. I think in some ways it's just the setting and the constant, maybe the constant darkness, maybe just for something as simple as in my brain of this being the first time that there are two female detectives as opposed to it just kind of has been disorienting me as okay, is this really what True Detective is? But I find myself thinking more and more that yeah, they seem to be building this story the same way as at least seasons one and three.
Yeah. I mean, I find myself thinking back to something I think you said in our first one of these about it being almost the opposite or inverse of,
Yes.
of season one.
Yes.
I think there's something to that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it said that's something Issa Lopez has said that she intentionally did, was to make it the opposite sort of reflection in a mirror of season one. Yes.
Yeah. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
So yeah, the story just real quick on the story about the case where they had their falling out reminds you of Walter White and Mike Trout half measures story. That's what first
uh,
came to mind. I thought we were going to get a sort of a beat for beat. I would never let this happen again. I should have taken the full measure when I should have taken the half measure. And in the end, it looks like they did take the full
oh
measure.
yeah, they killed that guy. But if
Yeah.
you say they, again, I couldn't help but sit there wondering
Yeah.
which one of them, because I'm imagining this is when they're having their big falling out.
Yeah.
So what makes the most sense?
Yeah.
Um, Danvers kills him, tells Navarro that they're going to say it was a suicide. She
He did.
chafes at that and doesn't want to go along, gets pushed out. Or Navarro kills him. Danvers is like, hey, you can't do that kind of thing
Yeah.
and work here. I'll cover for you, but you got it could be either one,
It could
really.
it, it could be either one. My money is on Danvers, the more I would say explosive of the two, the more the superior of the two. Uh, Navarro seems to be much more about let's bring someone in front of us so we can have justice for things that have been done. Desperate to find the person that took Annie's life. Again, I could be completely wrong, and it might just be a 50-50 at this point, but my money's on Danvers having done it, and then, as you said, Navarro being unwilling to stay there and go along with the story, so we're shipping you somewhere else.
Yeah. Also, maybe 50-50 on whether we find out. Again,
Exactly.
like, does this connect up with anything else? Although we were talking about this a bit before too, in rewatching season one a bit, there's a whole lot of stuff about their personal lives. Actually, it's all over the place, right? So, similarly here, the show is as much about that as about the case, and that's another way maybe in which it does actually feel like True Detective.
Yeah, we get into a lot of that this episode. Anything on that you want to touch on? Whether we get some stuff with Navarro's mom and sister in this episode, quite a bit actually, both sister and mom, some backstory and sort of what's happening now.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about the stuff with regard to Navarro's mother.
Hmm.
We get a few things in different places here in terms of information.
Yeah.
They were in Boston. Her father was abusive. Her mother brought them to Alaska, I guess.
Yes. To get far
Um,
away. Yeah.
but she says that her mother was murdered, but they never caught the guy. But then there's also some weird indication that her mother went out on the ice and disappeared or something like this.
Yeah.
She's upset about not knowing her name. I'm sorry, I can't say that. Do you have it? The
I no, I didn't even attempt to. First of all, on the screeners we had, there was no subtitles on this on this one,
yeah.
so I didn't want to attempt to make a wrong attempt there.
Um, but that comes up later when they're seeing Oliver. He wants to know
Yeah.
her native name, as it were.
Yes.
And so you're getting this backstory that apparently she doesn't know.
Right.
Um, her mother had a history of mental illness. We already sort of knew that. We're seeing that with her sister, who has said several times she's not like mom, but
Yeah.
kind of clearly seems to be like mom. So what's going on here? Schizophrenia or something, perhaps. I don't
Hmm.
know. We haven't been told. Um, and let me go ahead and take this in the direction of the scene in the hospital because I have a question here.
Yeah.
Right? Uh, as I've already said, it is not at all plausible to me that this guy Lund survived as long as he did. Put that to the side. We're watching TV. Okay, don't worry about that. But they come and talk to him together, and he mumbles, some things. There's some bits in there. But the really striking thing is after Danvers has left the room, And after he's been sedated by the nurse, he sits up in bed
Yeah,
in a very horror movie
very much
vibe.
so. Yeah.
And then continuing that vibe, there's like a deep voice, telling Navarro that her mother is waiting for her. Did that really happen?
Oh, did it really happen?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question because we get this scene earlier in the episode where Navarro, it's like she slipped on the ice. But I sort of took that as she hit her head and went to this hallucinatory state of she was in like a desert for a minute or two. Um, so did that actually happen? Oh, that's a
Yeah.
great question. I think that there's no sort of continuity break between what we see there and we see him lay back down and then go into, I guess, cardiac arrest and he dies at that moment.
You
So I
hear him
took it as yes,
flatline. Yeah.
that this literally happened. But are we getting clues that Navarro is more like her sister and her mom than we think? That's a great question.
Right. It's because, see, at first, I took it as happening, right? As we were talking
Yeah,
about just a moment ago, we're conditioned such that what we see, you presume, okay, that is really real. But Navarro is the only one who experiences this.
yes,
You've got a history within her family of hallucinations and so on, it would seem. Um, it seems, and then she doesn't mention it. Now, I mean,
yeah,
of course, she's immediately distracted by Annie K's phone,
right.
also. Um, so I don't know. I just want to point out the question, I guess. I don't know if there's a real answer here, but I think there is a question.
Yeah, there is a theme here, sort of starting with even last episode with the sort of the speech that Rose gives about, I think the world is old, and I think where Ennis is where it's coming apart in the seams, and so the things that we think are real and the things that are that we sense as are true versus false, or sort of that line is being blurred here where we are. That theme is coming out here, and if that's the case, yeah, I've not considered that, but that wouldn't surprise me that um, Navarro has this family history. We are inundated with that in this episode that we sort of get clues of she's experiencing that as well, and that comes out. I think that is something that would come out later if that in fact is the case.
Yeah. Or at least there's enough space for the deflationary Danvers explanation.
Hmm.
Again, I don't know about with regard to the idea that this guy survived frozen for a couple days, but
Yeah,
that we just have to put to the side. But it is very much like, why would he be talking about her mother? They'd sedated him. There's nothing plausible about what happens there, really.
yeah.
Um,
I have to say I had a hard time reconciling the fact that this vet that Pete brings in says, "Oh, they died before they got to the ice. They died before they froze here." But Lund is, forget the fact that he was in the elements for however long and still alive, that he did not die before he got to the ice. He's
yeah,
found alive. So I had a hard time sort of
that's a
reconciling that
nice question too.
that again, there are plenty of people who witnessed Lund awake and making these noises and going crazy and having to sedate him. So it's not all in Navarro's head or not just
Yeah.
experienced by Navarro. So yeah, that's just something, again, we could,
Apparently he survived and went to the hospital and got some amputations, and all of
yeah,
that seems pretty well established. But you're right. I mean, of course, our source here is like Pete's cousin or
it's cousin.
cousin's friend, or I think his name's Vince, who's a vet. I did like the moment when Danvers asked if he could do maybe just a little postmortem,
Yeah.
because I don't think she was kidding. Actually, she
Yeah.
she she goes, "Oh, of course I'm kidding. That would be totally illegal." Uh, but so his judgment is that they died before they froze, because if they died from the freezing itself, well, I've seen animals die that way. It's very sort of peaceful death.
Yeah.
These guys are frozen in a state of, terror.
Yeah.
So we're hypothesizing that they died prior to freezing. But we don't know what happened still, and then we've got very little forward movement on Raymond Clark, the prime suspect in this episode was
Yeah,
not
I mean
found
that
or anything.
almost nothing happened there this episode, and it almost seemed to me like they were trying to say that's staying over there with Hank while we move on to this other guy, Oliver, who was at the station, who knew Raymond, knew about this relationship. So I mean, we kind of hypothesized last week that Raymond Clark is, that early in the season is a bit of a red herring. Yeah, sure, maybe he did some things, but is this the ultimate sort of, for lack of a better term, big bad of the season? Probably not.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, of course, they are tracking down Oliver, trying to track down Raymond. They're
Yep.
doing it that way and object to what Hank is doing, getting all of the hillbillies, as Danvers calls them, to go search, which yeah, I would object to that too, probably. Particularly when Navarro says they want him alive, and Hank goes, "Do we?"
Do we? Yep.
Yeah, that's not great. Um, what do you think about this guy Oliver, though? So the connection is that they find the photo, takes him to the hairdresser. The hairdresser ultimately fesses up that she did know Raymond Clark. She took Annie with her to cut the guy's hair at Slaw.
hmm
Um, Annie and Raymond had an affair, but she was having an affair with this guy Oliver.
Yeah.
Where's he?
Yeah.
Oh, he quit right before Annie was murdered.
Right.
That's what she says.
And doesn't
And
want them
disappeared.
found and is off the grid and is all of this stuff. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
disappeared.
Yeah.
Um, she seems almost a little too understanding of that, in my opinion. It's like, hey, what happened to your boyfriend? Disappeared. Did it happen to be right before Annie got murdered? Yeah,
Yeah. You
so
you predicted a couple of weeks ago that something in this mystery has to do with the impact of the mines or the environmental things that are happening here. And I think that we have to now combine that with what's being done at the research station for some combination of what they're studying, what they're doing, what they're uncovering, being not integrated, but somehow conflated with what's happening at the mine that's poisoning people is,
hmm,
you know, causing a bigger problem than just a few guys in the ice. Like this is, a much bigger deal. And Oliver knows about it. Raymond found out about it. These were the guys studying it. So there's something
and
bigger at play here.
and what we were told from the geology teacher or whatever he teaches, whatever his name was, sorry,
Yeah.
random guy we may not see again. He said something about microbes in the ice that would like cure any disease, or I forget
Yes.
exactly how he put it, right?
These are cells who do not, cells that do not have any denigration to them, something like that.
There's some kind of
Yeah.
there was some kind of indicating like this is going to cure cancer and all
Yeah.
illness in the world, but you can't get it down to the ice.
Yeah.
It was something like that line again. Yeah, put realism to the side on that, but that
Yeah.
would be interesting if that gets tied in some way. What if all the other guys in the corpus will also wake up? No, we got zombies. I don't know. I don't know if we're gonna go that far.
Yeah. I mean, I think for as skeptical as she is and as practical, she even says in that car conversation, there's a real explanation to all of this. I don't think Danvers was necessarily understanding the depth or the magnitude of what's happening to the people in this town, but she sees while she's at the home of the people who lost the baby, had a stillborn baby, she washes her hand with like black water that's coming out of the sink. So she's getting a sense that um, whether the connection has been made at the research station, probably not, but there is something serious happening as a result of this mine, which is then
Mhm.
why, of course, she absolutely freaks out at Leah when she sees that she's getting involved in that type of the protest that's happening there.
Well, I mean, I think she also says to Navarro, she believes that the mine. Well, Navarro says people running the mine killed Annie, right? But Danvers points out, look, it's just like half the town employed here. If the mine goes under,
Yeah,
and she says something like, look, half the town has a stake
exactly.
in that mine. It could be one way or the other. So, um, But I want to mention also with this guy Oliver, because I do find him. They tell him that the guys from Slaw Station are all dead.
Yes.
And he asks about one by name who happens to be Lund.
Hmm.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, my theory is, were they working on something that either had some sort of healing properties, regenerative properties, something that could help save one if they were, someone, or prevent some things from happening to someone? Did somebody test something on Lund? Was Lund a have some sort of was he a case that has come out of some of their research that would prevent something like that from happening to him, and why he might be shocked that that's the one he brings up as, are you sure that Lund is dead? Other ones I find, but that Lund, are you sure about that? I just thought, yeah, it was very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, or it could just be that, Lund was his bestest buddy.
Yeah.
You don't know, but it was noteworthy to me that it was like, oh, he specifically asked about the one guy who very weirdly wasn't dead. I guess he is dead now. I mean, we do hear him
Yeah.
flatline, and let's see that we've got the video. What else we have to talk about here?
Yeah, so the last scene of this episode is they're at the hospital where they're trying to get some information out of Lund, and we see Pete, because he's quote under 30, has broken into Annie's phone. He's figured out a way to do it, and comes across this video that appears to be Annie in the ice, surrounded by ice, and she says, my name is Annie Hartow. If anyone comes across this, and then there's just these horrific screams, and video shuts. Or no, we see sort of pan down the hallway as the video is screaming, but she's off
Yeah,
camera. We don't
yeah,
see what's happening to
yeah,
her. That's sort of how the episode ends.
and very, very tropey, kind of.
Yeah,
If anything happens to me,
yeah,
like
exactly.
immediately after she says that, she starts screaming, and that's
Yeah,
fine. It's fine. It works.
but no clear
Um,
indication of where she was, who was in a video with her that we saw in this episode. Um, but certainly there was a record of this before. Clearly something traumatic happened to her. It's couldn't help but have me think that, okay, something happened to her while she's next to ice, but they didn't find her in ice like the guys from the research station. They found her like in a storage container, beaten and assaulted. So some differences there, but um, we may be dealing with a sense of, it was a who for Annie and a what for these other guys.
yeah, I don't know. And she was stabbed like a
Oh
certain
yeah,
number of times, like 28 times or something. And I
yeah,
think it was
yeah.
like a,
32,
um,
I think it was.
I don't know if that's going to be important. We'll look
Yeah.
up the number. All right. And I think it was like star shaped, and that was one thing that I saw some people pointing to as at least a callback. Um, we're left with a cliffhanger there, obviously.
Hmm.
The other big question is on this whole thought of who she is, right? This she's awake.
Yeah, I mean, this is from the very first few minutes of the first episode. I believe we hear Lund say something about she when he's screaming before they sedate him. So what this is, how is it related to these deaths? How is it related to the caribou we see at the beginning of the very first scene in
Mm,
the series? What is this she? And does it again relate back at all to this idea that, is Rose some kind of soothsayer where she can see that something mystical, evil is coming from this area and is penetrating some of the people and animals that live in this area?
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Is it Navarro's mother? Probably not. Um, is it the primordial she that pre-exists the ordered cosmos?
Yeah.
That's where
I think
that's what I put my
Rose,
chips on.
right. When Rose is discussing the spiral, she says that it represents something that's older than the ice.
Yeah,
So I think that we've got that in the back of our minds as well as we look through all this.
yeah. What was before the beginning?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, that goes back, I think I wrote a little bit about this in my part two recap is what's before the beginning is sort of this idea of light versus dark. There was only dark, and eventually the light began to penetrate it. This is kind of the ending of True Detective season one, some of the conversations that they're having. But the light might have won in certain places, but certainly is not won completely. So it's in this one of these places as it's now dark completely
Mhm.
is that what's winning in this, in this part of the world.
Well, you have this thought that related to that, if you want to take it this way, that the dark comes first, right?
Right.
There is the darkness, and then let
Yep.
there be light. You get
There be light.
biblical,
Yep.
right? What comes before the light?
Yeah.
Everything was dark, I guess, So, I mean, I think it does tie in, and you're right. I mean, season one hits that over and over again, kind of light versus dark and all of that sort of thing. So,
Exactly.
really
And
curious to
it's
see.
very interesting if you go back and watch season one. That is the conversation of how that season ends. Right. This is not going to spoil season one anyway, but just this conversation that there was darkness. Now we see some of these stars, and Marty points out that, if you ask me, it looks like the light's starting to win.
Yeah,
Well,
right.
it doesn't exist where they are now in Ennis, Alaska. So can the light win at all when it doesn't exist?
Yeah. They can probably see stars, but
Yeah,
not,
probably systems.
anyway, it's dark all the time. The sun's not shining, it's night for, whatever,
Right.
60 days or whatever. Yeah, good. So really curious to see where this goes. We're halfway through, which doesn't feel right to me, but I guess they're gonna make progress here over the next 3 hours, and
Yeah.
six is what they wanted. I hope they got what they wanted.
I hope so too. I mean, no other True Detective season is fewer than 8 episodes, so we're gonna have to really fly through some things, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Um, all right. Well, I think that about does it for this one. So thanks for joining us. As always, we will be back each Sunday night with kind of this recap and analysis pod on True Detective and with the news and notes up front. So I hope you'll just keep joining us. Next week, we go to part four. Um, in the meantime, you can feel free to, check out TVObscast.com, read some articles. You can read Brian's written articles on the season of True Detective, other stuff on previous seasons of True Detective you can find on there and on other shows. Check out the YouTube channel and subscribe to that. I'm kind of trying to push that at this point. Um, the podcast episodes will show up there, and then we're also putting up some like audio visual versions of written articles. We'll see how that goes. People are into it. Follow us on social media, search for TV Obsessive, and yeah, we'll see you next week.
All right, part four next week. See you then.